So why don't I formally begin the event, and glad to have our additional students and faculty come in. Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to have you with us on Zoom today for a very special event, the 2020 Lives in Public Policy and Public Service Address. My name is Nina Bose. I teach political science and I direct our public policy program, as well as our Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency, both of which are in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs. And I am so delighted to welcome you today to this talk by our distinguished alumnus, Colby Ickowitz, class of 2005. I'm going to give a formal introduction in a moment. Let me just begin with just a little very short discussion of what this lecture series is about, and then also would like to recognize several of my colleagues and people throughout the university who have helped make this event possible. But let me just start with to say this address is one of our most special events in the public policy and public service program, because we created this lecture series a few years ago. The first one was in 2017, to actually bring public leaders to campus to share their personal journeys as they pursue careers in policymaking and public service, whether that be through elected office, through working for organizations, through working in fields that influence and inform policy, such as our wonderful speaker today. And we wanted this to be specifically designed for students to hear how senior leaders in their fields tell us about their achievements, special challenges, their narratives of their journeys in public policy and public service. The Kalikow School Public Policy and Public Service program was developed from 8 departments: anthropology, economics, global studies and geography, history, philosophy, political science, religion, and sociology. And we, of course, our program works with the schools of business, journalism, health professions, and numerous other offices and organizations and institutes across the university. This is truly an interdisciplinary lecture series as part of this program, as part of the public policy and public service program. And it means so much when our speaker has a close connection to Hofstra University, as our speaker today does. And so let me just say, before I introduce Colby, I want to just give great thanks to the Public Policy and Public Service Programs Program Council, with members from each of the departments that created the series, and unanimously enthusiastically agreed to invite Colby to speak on our campus. The Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, Dean Rifkin, who extended the official invitation and kindly had made this series possible. The Office of University Relations, particularly Carol Mallison and Kathleen Collins, the Office of who make everything run so smoothly. The Office of University Relations, Melissa Connolly, Carla Schuster, and everyone else on their staff. And a very, very special thanks to our political science department. This is one of our alums, along with the Department of Journalism. And I know that several of my colleagues are in the audience. If I don't see you, my apologies, but I see Dr. Parati, Dr. Green, Dr. Himmelfarb, Dr. Dudek conveyed her best wishes and will be joining us later. It means so much to have one of our alums here and sharing her narrative in the world of politics and public affairs, particularly in this tumultuous year that has truly been like no other in recent memory. I want to extend a warm welcome, of course, to the 3 classes at least that I know are here. My first-year American politics class, Dr. Green's American politics class, and Dr. Himmelfarb's in my presidential election seminar. It's wonderful to see all of you here. Just as far as formatting, let me just say, or the structure of this event, Colby will speak after I introduce her for about her work, longtime expertise in the world of journalism and politics. Um, I have some questions for Colby, but we're going to try to keep as much time as possible for questions from the audience, especially student questions, and probably from some of your professors too, Colby. Um, what we're going to do to try to keep this smooth, and because of audio reasons, we'll ask everyone if you would send the questions either to me directly in the chat, or you can post them and I'll go through them for Colby to answer. I will say, because this is such a because our speaker graduated from Hofstra, spent 4 years here, we had hoped to have her on campus for a lunch meeting, class visit. We will do that as soon as we are able to. That is absolutely at the top of our event calendar. But if students would like to ask questions and unmute, please let me know. You can just send me a direct message on the chat, and I'm glad to open that up as well. But let's get, without further ado, because we don't have a lot of time, it's never enough. Let me introduce our wonderful speaker, Colby Ickowitz, who is the national politics reporter for the Washington Post. Colby is a graduate of Hofstra, the class of 2005. She double majored in journalism, print journalism, and political science. During her time at Hofstra, in addition to excelling in her coursework, she was editor of the Chronicle, Hofstra Chronicle, in her senior year. In 2004, she was one of the early participants in Professor David Green's, what have become now regular trips to New Hampshire, but she was one of the pioneers in I believe it was that year, Dr. Green, that there were 2 trips, we were saying, in November of 2003, and again right before the primary. And Colby was telling me right before the talk began that was when it was in a van, as opposed to the 2 buses now, the bus loads that we now send. But this, and I know that Colby also was an active participant in the Department of Political Sciences trips to Washington, D.C. So from her college days onwards, we have seen the bridging of academic study and practice that we encourage so much from encourage students. That seems standard today. I would say in the early 2000s was really kind of demonstrated real initiative to do that. After graduating from Hofstra, Colby worked at Congressional Quarterly, covering Capitol Hill and transportation policy. She then worked for, I believe it was her hometown newspaper, the Allentown Morning Call, as their correspondent for Washington, D.C. Colby joined the Washington Post in the spring of 2014, where she has covered a number of areas, including national policy, health policy. She was responsible for the Inspired Life blog, and she's written about in the Loop column about the quirks of the federal government and campaign. And there is quite a bit to add from 2020, I'm sure. It's probably a book underway, Colby, once 2020 is concluded. I must say that while we invited Colby in January, when the biggest news seemed to be impeachment, and we kind of had set the stage at that point. We had planned for this date, November 12th, thinking a week after the election would be a good time to assess, to talk about being on the campaign trail, covering the race for the White House. And of course, we had no expectation or no idea of what the world that November 2020 would bring: masks, social distancing, and Zoom. What this has meant, however, I was last week when it was, as I saw Colby's daily reporting on the Washington Post, I was thinking that if we had been asking her to come to campus, she might have had to change her plans, given how her schedule has been round the clock reporting with no end in sight for the near future. But the beauty of Zoom is that we are able to, though I know that your schedule is packed, Colby, you've kindly reserved this time for us, as you promised 11 months ago in another world. And we are so grateful to you, so appreciative of your time. And really just on behalf of the Political Science Department, the Kalikow School, and Hofstra University, let me just give you the warmest welcome. We're so glad you're with us, and let me turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. It's I really wish I could be on campus with all of you, but like Mina said, hopefully in the future. It's been a while since I was there, and I'd love to come back. But so when I first pondered this question of how political journalism informs policy, I found myself taking this really cynical view. I thought about the election that we just witnessed and how it has underscored that we are, in fact, a country split in two, living in two very different realities. My fact-checking colleagues at the Washington Post have tracked more than 22,000 falsehoods told by President Trump over his first term. Every time the president has spoken about voter fraud in the last 6 months or so, we've written that those claims are in fact baseless and unsubstantiated. And yet we saw more than 70 million Americans voted for him. And so it was hard then to think, are we informing policy? Do we have an effect, the effect on public opinion that I always believed that political journalists did, and I believe we still do, and I'll get to that in a bit. But it has been a strange 4 years to be a national politics reporter where writing facts can appear as bias. The Washington Post, we are diligent about making sure that everything we write is true. And yet by just fact checking the president, to half of America, that can seem like we're taking sides, when in fact we're just, again, reporting the truth. So I think there's a few ways that we got here, some of which began before Donald Trump, but I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit of my brief backstory. I came to Hofstra as a freshman. When I came to Hofstra as a freshman, which happened to be actually a week before September 11th, which was a total, there were so many culture shocks happening for me. I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania. Suddenly I'm in Long Island, and then September 11th happened. So there was a lot. But there was two things that I knew for sure. I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I knew I wanted to write about politics. And I was almost certain that that meant a career in political journalism, but I hadn't ruled out pursuing something more inside the action, like speech writing. And so that's why I took these dual tracks. I wanted to major in print journalism and also political science to really see where my passions lied. A year earlier, I'd been working a summer job at a snack bar when I started flipping through a discarded Time magazine. Now this was 2000, so we're talking about the Gore-Bush race. And there was a side-by-side graphic of Bush and Gore and where they stood on the various issues. And I didn't know anything about politics then. I don't come from a political family. We didn't discuss current events at the dinner table. But there was something about that Time magazine spread, the way that it distilled the issues in these really digestible ways, that I found myself really drawn into it and really interested in these issues outside of my own bubble and the different ways that these two candidates were coming at them. And I was hooked. I was a political junkie ever since. I mean, in the beginning, it was a little more superficially than substantially. I hung a photo in my bedroom of the 2001 class of female senators. I bought a Hillary Clinton Senate beanie baby that is actually still on my desk. So I'm not sure that I was really delving into the issues in any profound ways, but I professed myself to be a junkie. In fact, this is a bit of a digression, but I remember when we were in DC with Dr. Parati, Bush's helicopter flew overhead and we all started kind of waving manically at it. And she just, she laughed at all of us and was like, even like, no matter what you feel about him, it's still just so exciting to be able to wave at the president's helicopter coming overhead. So back to Hofstra. Because I wasn't 100% sure whether I wanted to cover politics or be in politics, I joined the Chronicle and student government within my first few weeks. By sophomore year, I was the editorial editor of the Chronicle and the Rules Committee chairwoman of SGA, which, by the way, is a huge conflict of interest. Should no way have been allowed, but so be it. So by the end of that year, the editor of the paper asked me to run to replace him as editor-in-chief. And a friend of mine on SGA was running to be president and asked me to be his running mate. And so for me, this was a serious crossroads. I really wasn't sure what I would be happier doing. Would I be happier running the Chronicle, or would I be happier being vice president of SGA, assuming that my friend won, and which he did. But and I spoke to my journalism professor at the time, Dr. Stephen Knowlton, who unfortunately isn't there anymore. But He told me that he believed that it was better to be the watchdog than the one being watched. And so I quit student government and I took over the Chronicle. Hofstra's President Rabinowitz started either that year or at the end of the previous year. So about 6 months in, I dispatched some of my friends around campus with a photo of him to ask people if they could identify him. And so we got a variety of answers. We got Sigmund Freud, a few people said Dick Cheney, but there were only, I mean, I was actually surprised it was even a third, but there was a third, I think, of the students that we polled that could identify him as Hofstra's president. So that week we splashed the Chronicle cover with photos of President Rabinowitz with the headline "Stew Who." And I can't speak to what his engagement is with the students now 15 years later, but at the time I distinctly remember it having an impact on him and his putting some effort into engaging more with students. He even mentioned at our graduation that ours was the class that figured out that no one knew who he was. And so I tell that story because this was my first taste of how journalism could hold people accountable and change behaviors. And while national reporters can shape narratives, the ability to really influence policy and elected officials really occurs at the local level, where they know that what's written is being evaluated, where the elected officials know that their actions are being evaluated by their own constituents. I mean, and there was a time in Washington when the Capitol was teeming with reporters from all over the country covering their state's delegations. In 2004, when I was a senior at Hofstra, I actually spent a semester in DC interning with Newsday. The Bureau had 14 reporters and editors at the time. Someone covering the Justice Department, someone covering intelligence, someone covering the Senate, someone covering the House, like 2 people on the White House. Today it has 1 reporter. 20 years ago, there were 225 members of the Regional Reporters Association. Now it's under 70. I spent 4 years as a regional reporter covering Pennsylvania, as Mina said, for the Allentown Morning Call. So I know a lot about what influence you can have at that level. And so, local newspapers have been struggling for years, but it's really been ravaged this year by the pandemic. Something like 11,000 jobs have been shed. And what that means is that lawmakers, whether you're on city council or in Congress, can get away with more because no one is watching. During my years for the Morning Call, I was on Capitol Hill almost every day. I was recording how our members voted. I was staking them out in hearings and hallways to get their take on the news of the day. Whatever was happening in the country, in the world, in the state, there were people right there to ask them so that the people back in Pennsylvania could know what their elected officials were doing in Washington. That's not as true anymore, and that's a real disservice. And so, as I talk about my cynicism, that plays a role as well, because it's heartbreaking to me that there isn't more accountability at the local level, both in local newspapers and in Congress. Unfortunately, there's also a trust issue, and it used to be true that local news sources were more trusted than national media. But the erosion of trust in the media has filtered down to their local papers as well. I think a poll last year found something like 30% of Americans trusted national news compared to 45% that trusted local news. I mean, these aren't very encouraging numbers for my industry. And the problem today, as I'm sure you've heard this all before, is that people don't consume news from the same sources anymore. Media is siloed, disinformation is rampant, especially when most people get their news these days from social media. It's hard on Facebook or Twitter to discern what's real news from fake. I mean, my own mother has been fooled before, and I've had to redirect her to a credible news source. But it takes real effort on the part of a reader to read an article that's shared with them by their social network and decide to then take the extra steps to try and verify that article is true. Especially when most people don't read past the headlines. And I'm guilty of not reading past the headlines a lot. Life is moving at us so fast and information's coming at us from all directions. And so, but the problem is it's allowed disinformation to spread. And that's why we have these 2 very distinct silos where people are getting news from very distinct sources. And when that occurs, it's really hard for anyone to distinguish truth. And it's hard for a newspaper, whether it's the Washington Post, whether it's Newsday, whether it's CNN or your local news station, to cut through that noise and just tell the facts and have people believe that the intentions are pure. Another thing that social media has done is it's given politicians a direct line to the public. Obama capitalized on this too, probably one of the first ones to do so, but Trump has made it an art form, which is you can talk directly to your supporters. You don't have to go to a reporter. And it's, for the politician, it's better, right? You don't have to go through the filter of a reporter who's going to fact check and provide nuance and background. You get to put your words out there, and that's all the information that your supporters are going to get. And so between like the one-sided, between the way that the politicians don't use the media anymore and the way that people digest news, I think it is harder than when I first started for the media to actually inform policy and public opinion on the scale that it used to. I do think, though, there's a lot of ways that media is deeply influential in how it covers candidates and campaigns, anointing winners and losers by deciding who's worthy of coverage. And so we obviously saw this in 2016 with the round-the-clock coverage of President Trump, then candidate Trump. And it didn't matter whether that coverage was negative or positive, because he was there and he was the face. And the thing that Trump did so expertly is that he turned it into an us versus them. It became a war with the media, a war with the press. And so the press could cover him and could point out every lie, every falsehood. And then he could go to his supporters and say, well, it's a war against us. We're at war with the press. They're the enemy. And so that just perpetuated and only spun more out of control throughout his presidency. The media can also perpetuate a narrative that once affixed to a candidate is really hard for them to shake off. I think a great example of this is Pete Buttigieg, the mayor from South Bend, who he kind of became a darling of the press in the early days when he was, he's a super impressive guy. And so he came out there and he got all these, he was really accessible. He'd give interviews to anybody. And then at one point, early on, when he started having some success, there was a suggestion made that he was going to struggle with African-American voters. And that narrative became a truth and was a detail in every story written about him. And no matter what he did, he put out this really detailed plan on race relations in America, kind of as a reaction to that. He really, I think, earnestly tried to change that narrative. And yet, if you go back and read any story about Buttigieg in the lead up to the primary, there was a line in almost every one that was like, comma, but he's going to struggle with African-American voters. And so once you tell African-American voters that this candidate is going to struggle with them, it's hard to break through that. And so I do think there's a lot of self-reflection that reporters need to do in a post-Trump era about how we cover politics. But I think there's some bright lights. I think the clearest evidence of how the media can still play a tremendous role in informing policy and changing public opinion was around the child separation issue at the border. I mean, once that story came to light, and came to light because of the press, and that story was the heartbreaking stories of the children separated from their families at the border were told over and over and over again, to the point where the Trump administration had no choice but to overturn it. I mean, the outrage over it was no longer partisan. I mean, I'm sure there were people, his extreme base were still going to be supportive of him no matter what, but there were a lot of people just horrified by that, and that was because the press shined a light. I think I should be wrapping up pretty soon to get to our conversation, but I think there's a lot of examples like that. My colleague, a good friend of mine, David Farenfold, did this Pulitzer Prize winning reporting on Donald Trump's charity during 2016. And after months of just like meticulous and deep reporting, he was able to expose that Trump was taking people's money and never actually donating that money to causes. And so the result of that ended up being that the Southern District of New York shut the charity down. I mean, that's because one reporter decided that he was going to figure out where the president donated, or then the candidate, where the candidate donated as a private citizen, as this self-professed billionaire, what these causes were. And he really did expect to find a number of causes and places where Trump had donated money, and the reality became that there weren't any. He would hold these big foundation galas at his own properties, right? And so that's just, he would take the money, and then that money would go to him because it was at his property, right? He would charge like huge fees to have these. And anyway, if you haven't read that coverage, I highly recommend that you go back and read that coverage, because that is just the most like beautiful example of investigative reporting, I think, in the last decade. But I will wrap up those thoughts, and because again, I think we're supposed to be moving on to the conversation part of this, but those are just some preliminary thoughts I had in pondering these questions.
Thank you, Colby. You've raised a lot for us. I was actually just trying to pull up the link.
Sorry.
See if I can put it in the chat in just a moment. Because just you've given us such an instructive narrative, both of your time at Hofstra and how you kind of came into politics.
Yeah.
I hadn't even realized that your first semester was September 2001. I mean, it's really kind of as the world changed,
right,
in the 21st century, and then moving forward from there. And how interesting that you had the choice of student government or or journalism. I think you're right. I don't think that it's possible to do both of those today now, but I guess at the time there was a lot of the revolving door, if you will.
Right.
One side to another. But I have questions specifically about 2020.
Yeah.
Maybe I thought, we'll talk for a few minutes and then I'll open it up for audience questions. But just given what you've told us about your career in journalism and the challenges for the media of the erosion of trust, right, and the need for the public to be informed participants in the civic dialogue, right, if not in policymaking. How would you advise students to follow reporting on politics, kind of just both as the election year, as we move forward, how you balance daily news sources, social media, news versus commentary? In the 1980s, which is when I was in college, the standard report was, I think, 3 daily newspapers and at least 1 weekly magazine. I mean, just even those words, right? Newspaper seems a little dated, right? The news is what we're looking at now. What would you, as someone who, this is your career, how do you keep up with the news, and what would you advise for students?
I mean, the reality of how people consume news is most people aren't going to the Washington Post homepage or the New York Times homepage or the Wall Street Journal homepage. Maybe they'll check it in the morning, but most people, again, are getting their news laterally, right? They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, although I don't think Facebook is cool anymore, but they're on whatever is cool now, and TikTok, or sorry, I sound really old. But and getting their news by what is shared among their networks. And so I think that is fine. I mean, I will admit that that's how I get most of my news. Now, granted, I follow mostly other reporters on Twitter, but I think that you can pick some really credible news organizations like the Post, like the Times, like the Wall Street Journal, maybe whatever your hometown newspaper is, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. And you can follow those news outlets on those social media sites, right? And so that way, when your ticker, I mean, Twitter really has become kind of the modern day wire. The headlines of the day are filtering through, as are like loud caps lock screaming by the president. But aside from that, you are getting, if you follow the right sources, you can get a lot of news. And then I think that's one way to do it. And I think another way to do it is if you see something shared in your network that seems a little like you've never heard of the news source before, the headline's seems a little outlandish, you have a gut check moment where you're like, is that right? Does that sound right? Just Google it. Like like I said, I've done this for my parents a million times, where I'll get a call from my dad. Did you hear X about Hunter Biden? And so, I'll do a quick Google search and find that it's been like debunked by 3 fact checkers, and or there's just no traditional media site has actually written that. And so that's another way to know when something most likely isn't true. If not a single media source that's trusted has written the story, then you're probably not reading it from a reputable source. And those are my two. And again, that takes the extra step, and it's harder, right? It's easier to just see a headline and then just keep going and have it in your head that whatever it is about Hunter Biden, I think it was that Hunter Biden got his brother's widow pregnant. This was like something that was being shared in like the right-wing blogosphere, that my dad asked me if it was true, and it's not true. So just be curious and play a little bit of the role of investigative reporter yourself, because Google's an amazing machine and a program that just allows you to fact check like immediately. If there's an issue that you're curious about, again, the Washington Post has a fact checking site. There's factchecker.org. CNN does amazing fact checking, incredible fact checking. You can always run it through a fact checking filter too to see whether or not something is true. I just think that making sure you're getting real information and true and honest information is the most important way we can go forward. It's really the only way we're going to fix democracy, is if we can all go back to starting with a foundation of truth. If we can begin with some fundamental truths, we can disagree about how to then get to the end goal, right? That's how it used to be, that everyone knew that we needed better healthcare, we needed a better education system, we needed better infrastructure, like that there were things in America worth fixing. And then there were policy debates about the best way to get us there. Right now, we're not even on the same page of like what the problems are, or we're so busy blaming each other for whose fault it is that the problems exist. And I think it will be hard to ever come to solutions if we can't first start at that foundation.
Okay, thank you. And as you're saying that, Colby, and in your comments earlier, you referred to going back to 2016, right? The role of the media, the influence of the media on the public, anointing winners and losers, right? And you talked about the war that Donald Trump, right, created with the media in 2016. Of course, you've been reporting in Washington. You started working after college in the George W. Bush administration, so covered through Obama and now through the Trump presidency. There were a lot of reports that the Obama administration's relationship with the media was fairly contentious. The efforts to clamp down on leaks, right? The difficulty of sharing information. Could you share kind of your perspective as someone who's been covering national politics through 3 presidencies now?
Yeah.
What has changed, and then maybe what continuities you've seen as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I alluded to earlier, Obama really did begin this trend of social media was just kind of in its infancy when he became president. I mean, Twitter started, I think, during his campaign. And so this idea that you can bypass the press and get directly to the people, and you're going to reach a larger audience and a more diverse audience that way. And so there was an effort by the Obama administration to go around traditional media, and they would also find really clever ways. They did that Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. They found clever ways to reach their audience that did not involve. I don't think the Washington Post had a sit-down interview with Obama like in his last term or something completely wild like that. Like he gave sit-down interviews to celebrities and again. So that was a serious cause of frustration for reporters during the Obama administration. But you got the truth, right? I mean, they weren't going to lie to you. The information they were going to give you, they were holding back. They didn't want to. They didn't want things to get out before they decided it was going to get out. But if you talk to them, they weren't going to lie. They might evade, but not lie. The Trump administration, the access is insane, right? I mean, reporters can call the president on his, I mean, I can't, but some reporters can call the president on his cell phone, right? I mean, he does sit down interviews in the Oval Office with reporters all the time. He holds these 2-hour press conferences where reporters can ask him as many questions as they want. But that's only helpful if the information you're getting is real. You can talk, he can talk for 5 hours, but if everything he's providing, or most of what he's providing, is misleading or false, then that's not helpful either to the public or to the industry. And so it's two wildly different approaches. And I think that there will be reporters in Washington that miss the access to the White House, the Trump White House, who will miss the fact that there were a lot of people on the inside that were willing to leak. They were willing to tell the kind of palace intrigue stories of the infighting and President Trump losing his temper. And there's a lot more loyalty to President Obama. There weren't people that were going to talk behind President Obama's back that way. And so maybe it wasn't fun, is not the accurate word, but it wasn't as, you couldn't get these like really sexy stories about this person fighting with this person, this one's going to get fired. And but they were doing serious work, right? I mean, it's a serious job to be president. And those are the two big differences that I think are obvious.
Okay. All right. I have so many follow-up questions. I'm looking at my list here and I'm going to ask 2, and then I'm going to open it up so that everyone else can participate, because I know they have as well. So here are my 2 questions. First one, you are your byline appears pretty much daily, and I found that really exciting up until last week. And then I was kind of getting a little nervous because I thought, well, if her byline is coming up every day, does that mean she's still going to be available? So I will say, I think when I got your message, you wrote back so quickly to say everything was set. And that was when I kind of was able to take a breath, say, okay, it's good. But I mean, I'm just looking at, just in the last 3 days, Georgia announces the hand audit. Biden speaks on healthcare, calls Trump refusal to concede an embarrassment. Joe Biden in victory speech says this is the time to heal in America. Top congressional Republicans silent on Biden win as Trump allies remain defiant. And the list goes on. And I know that in many cases you're working with your colleagues, right? But your name is on all of these daily news updates. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you how these are produced and what this entails for you to do that work?
Sure. So the Post started this idea of having these live update files during the impeachment. And myself and 2 colleagues were assigned with kind of creating this model of, rather than have one story that gets updated throughout the day, you would give people mini stories with headlines that makes it a lot more digestible. And that way people could come at any point in the day and they could catch up really quick. I mean, the impeachment was moving really fast, right? All those hearings, they were long. No one was going to sit and watch 12 hours of an impeachment hearing other than myself and my colleagues. But and so this model was created, and it was so wildly successful. Readers loved it. I mean, my husband told me that it was the only thing he read about the impeachment was that on his walk home from work, he would start at the bottom at like the 7 a.m. and then he would just scroll through and then by the end of it, he would be completely caught up on the day's news. And so because it was so wildly successful, the Post started doing it for everything. Sporting events, hurricanes, basically anything where there was going to be a constant, I mean, the coronavirus, we've had a coronavirus live updates file since March, where a select number of reporters are assigned to making that happen. And so I guess sometime in July, they started up our 2021. And myself and the 2 colleagues who did the impeachment one were brought in to do the 2020 campaign live updates file. And so what that entails, luckily we have a team of incredible reporters covering the White House and the campaign. And so they're constantly feeding stuff, their own reporting. And then my colleagues and I are doing our own reporting too, whether that's covering Trump speeches or Biden speeches or Senator Harris speeches. whether we're monitoring kind of a theme like Republicans being silent or Republicans siding with Trump on this refusal to concede. And that just rolls all day. And, you know, there were times that it would roll 24 hours a day. Now, luckily, the way that it probably looks like I'm working more around the clock than I actually am, because luckily they've assigned us all shifts. And so the way that it works is the three colleagues, we each have a third of the day that we're responsible for. But those 8.5, 9 hours are, I mean, they've slowed down a bit this week, but during from August till November 3rd, it was nonstop. But yeah, so that's how, I mean, that's another great way to your earlier question, to follow the news. Some of it can be a little, you know, it's incremental, right? It's little things that change throughout the day that get updated, but it is a really easy way to follow the news of the day.
Right.
So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
No, very much. And actually, as you're saying this, you're reminding me that when we first spoke last January, you referred to this, and
Yeah.
I had forgotten that this was a new. It's become so standard now,
Right.
just
Right.
in the last 11 months,
Right.
that I had forgotten that when we spoke, this was something that you had started, right? You had
Yeah.
started working on for the impeachment, and how quickly that becomes. I think it's a pretty significant innovation in news coverage that will probably continue beyond the
Oh, it
election.
will. I mean, that to your point, it's become a model across news outlets, from the New York Times to CNN to local regional news sources. Almost everyone is using a live update file model now for breaking news. And really, the Post started that with their impeachment live update file. So I think we're pretty proud of the fact that we created this new model for better or worse. I think mostly for better, but
yeah, no, I mean, great example of institutional change at work. Let me just say to everyone, we're going to start with the Q&A in just a moment. I'm going to ask Colby one more question. And Colby, I did find one of David Fahrenthold's articles from 2016. There were actually several. I'm just going to put one in the chat so that students can see what you were referring to and can follow up on those on that reporting. There can be. I'm going to conclude my questioning for now with a kind of a fairly open 2020 presidential race coverage question. And that is, you know, I know since the pandemic, you like all of us in the information business are largely working remotely, right? To get your sources and to get your information. Can you identify a particularly significant high point or challenge over the past 11 months, or maybe even if we focus on the general election campaign from the conventions, given how packed the last few months have been?
Yeah. I mean, the challenges are probably easier to think of than, than the high points, but I mean, this is going to be the most obvious answer, but the pandemic, not just because the pandemic kept us all home and made it so that we couldn't have traditional political conventions and be out on the campaign trail in normal ways. Not even talking about that. Basically just the fact that we shifted focus to now the president was in charge of a global health crisis that was killing thousands of Americans. And so anything that came before that didn't really matter anymore, right? I mean, everything that we would have written about during the 2020 election, everything we were talking about pre-March, took a back seat. And I think what Joe Biden's campaign did pretty expertly is they never lost sight of that. They made the coronavirus and the White House's handling of it the focal point of their campaign messaging pretty early on and then consistently through. But you had this again, these war on facts, right? So you have health officials saying, we can slow the spread if everyone wears masks and if everyone social distances. And then you have the president of the United States telling people you don't have to wear masks and you don't have to do social distance, do whatever you feel like. It's going to be over soon. Don't worry about it. And so we had to, that's not, it wasn't supposed to be political, right? Like there was no, like the coronavirus should not have been a political topic. It should not have been the topic for campaign reporters, and yet it became one because it became everything, the mask issue was a political issue. You know, wearing a mask became a sign of your political leanings. And so I think that was a challenge just as a human being, as a person worried about her family and her friends and the world, to now have to write about public health issues through the lens of politics.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to hold off on my questions, so I still have a fairly long list here. But I'm going to turn it over, open it up to students. And I know the Zoom setting is can be a little intimidating, but Colby was a Hofstra student. She's been on our campus. Please don't be shy. You can send the question directly to me, or if you put your hand up, then I'll see if we can call you. Dr. Parati, I see that you just put yours. If you'd like, why don't we unmute you and you can ask it directly since you know Colby so well. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll get started so everybody can get their wheels going. Colby, thank you so much for your work. Your work has truly kept us informed and has done a great service, I think, to the country. My question is about Trumpism. You know, Tom Perez, I heard him interviewed yesterday on NPR saying that Trump has lost the election, but Trumpism has not been defeated. Trumpism, I think, is going to require a lot of oxygen. And I wonder whether it has occurred to the media that coverage of Trump in the way that he's been covered as president might give it that oxygen. And has there been any consideration of whether or not he should get all the attention that, for instance, he got during the primary period in 2016?
Right. It's a really good question. And I think that's one that we're all grappling with, because this is just, I can't, this is not a fact, but I can see a world where Donald Trump continues to act like he's president by holding big rallies and holding press conferences, and creating this kind of alternative reality where he's constantly kind of countering the Biden administration and rendering, in some ways, the Biden administration ineffective. Because as long as Donald Trump is out there holding rallies and being the face of the Republican Party, the Republicans in Congress are not going to challenge him. They've made that perfectly clear, right? So there will have to be a reckoning where we, as the press decides, again, to your point, how do we cover these rallies? Do we cover these press conferences? And I will say that one thing that gives me a little hope is that when the president held, I think it was on Thursday after the election, he held a press conference to discuss the evidences of voter fraud across the country and how he was the true winner of the election. And he was about 4 words in when MSNBC cut it and just said, I think it was Brian Williams, said, like, we can't in good faith show this because it is all untrue. And so I don't think that calculus was taken before. And another thing that's been, even in my own reporting, you know, used to be before November 3rd, most of anything Donald Trump tweeted, we would, not everything, but we would write about a lot of it, and we would put it in context and we would give it background and we would call him out if it wasn't true. But we've taken to now, like, he tweets about voter fraud all day, every day, and we don't write about it because there's nothing to give. That oxygen would be to allow him a platform to say what we know is not true, which is that there are not widespread evidences of voter fraud in this country. He is not the true winner of the election. That's not partisan. That's not political. That's just fact. I mean, and so my saying that sounds like I am a supporter of Joe Biden, that I am in some way endorsing Joe Biden's campaign, when in fact, what I'm endorsing is truth and facts. And Dr. Preddy, I do worry a lot that we are going to live in two alternative realities. And even if the press, you can call them mainstream press, if the press doesn't cover him, there will be other outlets that do. And so will that create an even more siloed structure where people that support Trump, people that voted for Trump, are going to get their news through the outlets that still cover him, where, the rest of America gets their news in other ways. And so it's going to be a real question. A lot of it will have to do with how Trump decides to spend his post-presidency, but I think he's giving us some indications of how he's going to spend it, and he will still be around. So.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just focusing on. We have a few student questions. I know students about to ask one, and then I have a couple that are coming in on the chat to me. So let me begin with. It's very exciting that our first student question is coming from a public policy and public service major. So Stephen, if you would unmute, please. Like to hear your question.
Sure, and I'd like to first thank Colby for coming, and I really appreciate you saying what role what role you guys have played in terms of trying to curb misinformation, because I've seen a lot out there. But my main concern as someone who's interested in policy and kind of interested in what the future of the media is, there were 70 million plus Americans that voted for President Trump. And I would say that a large majority of those people would say that in some form, either there's the perception that the media is biased, or that they feel that the media is biased. And so I would ask, going forward, is there any way to combat this in terms of journalist by journalist, or just as an organization in general? How can the media move forward and kind of regain the trust of these people, or even turn that perception around, because I think it's harmful for the future of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. The erosion, like I said in my remarks, the erosion of trust in the media and the press could be one of the is a threat to democracy, right? Because if we're not operating again, if we don't believe that there is a fundamental foundation of truth, then there's nowhere to go from there. I think that, often I like to separate out television, cable news from the Washington Post, the New York Times. And so, a lot of people, when they talk about the media, they're talking about punditry on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. And those talking heads who get on there and they just kind of spout about whatever the conventional wisdom of the day is, have made clear that there is somewhat of an agenda to their coverage. I just think that is true. I don't believe that newspapers have done that. And I think the problem is, at one point, early in my career, when you were going to write about an issue that was considered divisive, climate change, gay marriage, there had to be this both sides-ism to your coverage. And so I did a lot of work on gay marriage in 2013, and you kind of had the sea change in public opinion and how it was working its way through the Supreme Court. And every story I wrote had to have a quote from a anti-gay marriage person to be able to provide balance. And every climate change story had to have some climate change denier in it. We don't do that as much anymore. And so it can give the perception of not being balanced, but there are just some things that we have decided are true. Climate change is real. Gay marriage, gay rights are civil rights. I mean, we've made these decisions. And so you can understand in some ways why someone who doesn't believe climate change is real, or someone who doesn't believe that gay marriage is a right, might look at the cover of a newspaper that's celebrating with rainbow flags the day after gay marriage becomes legal in this country and think, this newspaper doesn't represent me, right? But I think that the both sides that we used to do was a disservice, giving voice to any type of bigotry or prejudice or anti-science isn't a public service. That doesn't really get to your question of, so that's how we got here. How we fix it is a much larger question. And it worries me every day. And it worried me, to your point, when 70 million Americans voted for President Trump despite the drumbeat of news coverage around not only his misleading statements and his falsehoods, but also his failures at protecting tens of thousands of Americans from a health crisis and separating children at the border. I mean, there's a problem when that news people aren't getting that news in the same way. There's a lot of Americans that probably don't even know about the child separation issue at the border. And I don't know, I wish I had a better answer for how to fix that. But it's going to be the struggle for the press for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Colby. I actually,
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I have a question now from a student. This actually picks up on what you were just saying about information. This is a first-year student in my first-year American politics course, Abby. Thanks for these two questions, Abby. She wants to know, what do you see as the future of journalism with how polarized media has become? So kind of picking up on what you were just discussing.
Right.
And then a follow-up, do you see social media becoming an enabler or disabler of truth in the future?
Right.
And before you answer that, let me just ask everyone in the audience, you're welcome to do either. If you put your hand up, I'm glad to call on you. You may also direct message the questions to me in the chat. Either one is fine as we go ahead. Please, Colby, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the second question first, I think we see social media sites finally taking some responsibility for the disinformation that's spread across their platforms. Twitter and Facebook have started flagging falsehoods, which has resulted in the president's tweets being flagged all day. So if you go on President Trump's Twitter feed, there'll either be a warning label over his tweet that you have to click past, or there'll be a clarification under the tweet to counter whatever he's saying about voter fraud or the election not being over or him winning. And so the problem is that can Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, can they keep pace with the sheer amount of disinformation and the clever ways that, whether it's international bots or whether it's some far left or far right, blog and so I do think that for the last 4+ years, probably longer, they have been enablers. I think there's an opportunity for them to try and fix it, but I think it's going to be really, really, really challenging, because that you see that there's already a backlash to the fact that they're flagging President Trump's tweets. There was that, I don't know if how many of you followed this, because it's a little inside baseball, but they took down a New York Post story about Hunter Biden. Both Twitter and Facebook wouldn't allow it to be shared. And that created outrage among people on the right who felt that was censorship. I mean, where's the line, right? Where's the line between making sure that disinformation is not spread and censoring people's right to free speech and their right to say whatever they want to say. And so that's going to be a real challenge going forward. And to your question about, so you have to remind me the future of journalism.
The polarized media.
Yeah. Much to the chagrin of journalists who really enjoy writing and really enjoy these kind of sweepy narratives and going out and spending 2 weeks with a person on the ground and writing these really robust stories, I think that the live update file model is going to continue, because people don't sit and read a 10,000 word magazine article anymore. They just don't. I mean, I rarely do, and I'm in the industry, right? So everyone's moving so fast. They're scrolling through their phone so quickly, and they just want the news, right? They just want the bold-faced what happened. And so we need to figure out a way to get that to them in a way that still provides context and nuance and facts. And this live update file has been a good model for that. And the question is, how do you convince somebody who believes that the Washington Post is fake news and an enemy to the people and is, anti-conservative, President Trump to read the Washington Post? And that I don't have an answer to. I think the more we can get people sharing real news instead of fake news, the more you can get people sharing a Washington Post article or a New York Times article in their networks. Perhaps that can increase the spread of real news, but I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but there was a fake news story spreads at some remarkable rate faster than a real news story on social media. And so that's what we're up against. And I think we just have to meet people where they are and just try and provide the news in as digestible ways as we can so that people will take it in.
Thank you. So I have two more questions that have come in from students. So I'm going to ask those, and then I know Dr. Green has a question as well. So I'll turn it over to you, David, after I get in these two student questions. The first one is actually from a student in Dr. Green's class, from Phoebe, asking and picking up on this question of news coverage and how I guess how you get people to read the news and accept, recognize facts, right? So this is the question. It's rumored that President Trump will start an online news media service to cater to his base. Do you comment on that? Do you find that worrying, troublesome, worrisome?
I think what I find worrisome about that is what I said earlier about a creation of two different realities in America, which already seems it already exists, it's already there based on how people consume news. But if you have a parallel Trump administration running at the same time as there's a Biden administration actually in the White House trying to get things done for the country, it's going to be really detrimental to both the media trying to get stories out, get facts out, reach readers, and to lawmakers and the Biden administration. I think what President Trump has, he is the face of the Republican Party, and he is the kingmaker at this point of the Republican Party, and everyone in the Republican Party knows that. And so whether it's about self-preservation, whether it's about judicial nominations and wanting to stack the courts with conservative judges, whatever the reason is, they are not willing. Few of them, this is not true of all Republican lawmakers. We have Mitt Romney and a few others who obviously have spoken out, but have been unwilling to challenge President Trump when he says something false, refuse to challenge him when he does something that could be really hurtful to democracy, like what he's doing right now. So I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could say, like, we have this great plan in place for how to counter a Trump media, empire, but I don't. And I hope that doesn't come off as cynical, because I really do believe that the work that the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, all these, the Miami Herald, is so critical to our country, to our democracy, to informing people. I think that you can still make real change through real reporting. The problem is convincing a rather large subset of people that's true. I mean, I think one problem has been that they look at news stories about the Trump administration that rely largely on anonymous sources. And what I know to be true, because I work there, is that goes through a very strict vetting process. Those anonymous sources' names are known by the top editors. It has to be approved. Everything's vetted. But all the reader is seeing is, according to interviews with 65 people in the Trump White House. And so to them, how do they know that that's real, that we really talked to 65 people in the Trump White House? I know we did, but and I don't know, again, I don't know how. Media literacy probably, and I mean, I guess one way to do it is starting young. There's media literacy programs for elementary school, middle school, and high school, making sure that people in college too, making sure people understand how to differentiate truth from non-truth. I think that's a really important thing that should be taught, like, as soon as you're old enough to read. So, and I think there are programs like that in the works. But for people that are already kind of only getting their news from the far left or the far right, yeah, I don't know how to bring those people back to trusting the mainstream press. I wish I did, but
I mean, as you're speaking, Colby, it makes me think about just your point about the challenge of the live updates, right? And it seems as though if there is constantly a point counterpoint, then everyone is so focused on updating constantly that there is no opportunity to actually build consensus, right? Or to kind of go from the news to building blocks for actually making decisions about policies and governance. It seems as though we're in a danger, there's a risk of being in a world of continuously point counterpoint without being able to reach any common foundation of knowledge.
Well, I mean, you can just look at, when I first came to Washington, they've passed budgets and appropriations bills, and they had robust debates on large infrastructure packages. And those debates were contentious, and it's not like everything was like rosy and easy, and that things weren't partisan. And there was certainly a lot of toxicity during the Bush administration. But there was a shared goal in getting the work done. That all changed when President Obama came to office, because there was a concentrated effort to ensure that he didn't get much done. And so, you know, you had the rise of the Tea Party, which was a huge factor, and we're kind of seeing the Tea Party rise again as the Trump base. You know, you had all these counter protesters to Obama in 2009, 2010, and so on. And then they kind of got folded into what's known as the Trump base. And I think you're going to see those people become the protesters again outside of Capitol Hill when they're trying to pass a stimulus for coronavirus or a new healthcare law. Yeah, I mean, I think about the things that I was writing in my early days at Congressional Quarterly, which is a very wonky and policy-driven publication. And sometimes I think, like, what are they? I haven't read it in a while, but like, what are they writing? Because we would like meticulously go through like the appropriations bill and like write about like the most like mundane change in funding for this program or that. And most of that now just happens through like continuing, you know, they just continue the funding from the previous year or for the previous couple of months. They did pass some appropriations bills last year, but the point being is that there does seem to be more of an interest in this point counterpoint, to use your words, than there is in consensus and finding some way. And that's, you know, President-elect Biden talks about that a lot, right? That he believes that he's going to be able to come in as this person with 50 years of DC experience, understanding a time when you could actually do that, and make that Washington happen again. And I'm not sure that again, I'm not confident that based on what we've seen since last Tuesday, that will be successful.
Okay, thank you. So I have two more student questions, and then I have two questions from colleagues. Dr. Green, I know you've been waiting a while. Would you like to ask your question directly?
And feel free to skip it because I want to sort of mine some territory that other students have asked about. Stephen asked about regaining trust in the future.
Yeah.
I was more interested in how we got here, and you spoke to that a little bit, Colby. And by the way, thank you for coming back to Hofstra. It's really great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. But you know, this trope of the dishonest press has been around for decades now, particularly on the right, maybe exclusively on the right, actually. And I've often sort of thought about if I could even identify a single story, a single major story, or any story where we have any evidence whatsoever that the press has outright lied about that story. And I can't think of a single one.
Yeah.
And so I guess because that perception is so divorced from my sense of reality, I wonder if you and your colleagues in the industry have a sense of what feeds that perception that the press is dishonest. What, at sort of a basic level, I would say a psychological, even emotional level,
Right.
what makes people cling to that perception, even though, and you had indicated as well, I mean, this is following decades of your industry's attempt to be, I would say, sort of falsely balanced and do the whole sort of false equivalency thing as well. Even after that, there's still this perception that the press is lying. Do you guys have a sense of where that's coming from?
I mean, I can't speak like industry wide, but I can speak from my own experiences. And I think that I don't want to exclusively, social media is not exclusively to blame because, to your point, this has been around for a long time and there has been distrust in the media. But I think that the ability to get information from wherever you want to get information, to be able to confirm, confirmation bias, right? To be able to have your own beliefs echoed back to you whenever you want it. I mean, you can Google anything and find something that confirms whatever you believe. And then that becomes your truth. And so I think that has made it a real challenge for mainstream press to, that is just providing the facts and the context and the background, particularly when those facts and that background might be counter to the belief system of people on the right. And so, particularly now, when we have to continuously write that the president is not telling the truth, when we have to just keep saying over and over again, this is baseless, this is unsubstantiated, this is misleading, there's no evidence of voter fraud. I mean, it's kind of like boilerplate language now in all of our stories. You could see how somebody who only gets their news from a certain, silo, and that silo is telling them there is voter fraud, Trump did rightfully win the election, would then look at our coverage and think, well, they're lying, or it's biased, or they're taking Biden's side, and again, I don't know how you convince people to not, there's always been conspiracy theorists, that's existed since the beginning of time. So, but the way that it can spread so quickly is the challenge, I think, for the press that didn't exist before. I hope that, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah, I mean, this is dialogue that I personally, could speak on and dialogue with you on for hours, but I think maybe we should let some students pop up here.
Yeah, I actually have two questions that kind of build upon this, though. I would like to as well. So there are two student questions here. They're both from my election seminar. Let me ask both, Colby, and then you can kind of respond as you will. Leah, who's a journalism and political science major, was asking about interviewing and how you avoid appearing biased or phrasing a question in a way. How do you phrase a question in a way that allows for an open answer rather than a defensive one? And then another question, let me just pair both of them here. Gopal, who's also in the class, political science major, says, as news media begin to show one side of an argument, even if we consider it to be true, people who don't identify with that platform start moving to others that resemble their own beliefs. Does this contribute to further partisanship and polarization of positions? We've been talking about that. And I think the kind of following from that then, how do news media like the Washington Post and other sources try to bring in, right, or try to get viewers to follow this platform of information?
Yeah. The interview question, it's a great question. And it's, it really varies by subject, right? And so we don't have a ton of time left, but I actually, I've interviewed Donald Trump in person once, by phone a few times, but once in person. And it was early in 2015 when his candidacy was still kind of seen as like a joke and a circus act, and no one actually took him seriously. And so I look back at that interview and I think, gosh, if I knew everything I know now, I would have done it so differently. But he was incredibly disarming, like in ways that I found really shocking. Colby, my favorite journalist. I mean, I've never met the person. I've never met Trump before in my life, right? And so right away, you're taken off balance, and the balance of power shifts. And so Trump is a unique case, but he has this way of just talking and cutting you off and talking that makes it almost impossible as an interviewer to cut through that noise and get him to focus, or to get him to find a way to follow up, because you've asked one question and he's 5 tangents later. I mean, I think I asked one question and suddenly he was like complaining to me about Bob Dylan. Like I don't even remember. Bob Dylan didn't want him using his songs or something. I don't, but it was completely unrelated to the question I'd asked. And so that's a challenge when people are as expert at manipulating interviewers as Donald Trump is. I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen it, Jonathan Swan from Axios did an interview with President Trump maybe a month ago or more. And it was a masterclass in how to interview a difficult person to interview. And the best way to do that is to be armed with facts. You have to go in there more prepared than they are. And I can't say that it's always been true of every interview I've done, but especially if you're interviewing someone like Trump, or you're interviewing an elected official who's going to be talking to you through their own filter and they want to get out their own spin. Jonathan Swan, some of it was in his incredulous facial expressions, but some of it was just in the fact that he had documents to be like, but Mr. President, that's not true. Like, I can show you right now on this piece of paper, those numbers aren't true. Like what you're saying. And it was, and somehow, maybe it's because Jonathan Swan is British, so he didn't sound as like, he didn't come across as threatening, but there is a way to do it without being confrontational, without sounding like you're trying to attack the person. I will say that I think it's harder for women to do that. I think that there's a lot of men that might not take an aggressive woman questioner as seriously. And it can, when they try to charm or be a little, like Trump did, flattering, it can throw you off your game. So the best thing you can do is just be prepared. If I could go back in time and do that interview again, I would have been much more prepared. I mean, I thought I was going in to cover like this silly guy who's making this silly run for president. I wish I'd known then that he was going to be the president of the United States. Because again, I think I would have, I wish I had done it differently. But anyway.
And then any comments about I mean, how fascinating, right? How much the world has changed in 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
You certainly weren't alone in that expectation, right? Or of where the campaign was in 2015. Any comment on the question about these the siloing of news?
Yeah.
There's a way to counter that. And actually, I'm going to add in there a question from another public policy major, Ben Welch, who's saying this could be a yes, no. If issues such as climate change or gay rights have now become partisan and more explicitly linked to the parties, is the perception, do you think the perception of the media as biased from the perception of at least 70 million plus people could be unsolvable? I'm hoping you won't say yes, but please.
Right. I don't think it's unsolvable. I think it's a problem larger than me to fix. But and I don't have all the answers. But I think that if I didn't believe it was fixable, then why would I might as well just quit today and go do something else. I don't know. But I have to believe that it's solvable because I believe so deeply in the mission of journalism, in the watchdog role of journalism. I've seen firsthand the impact of journalism. And so maybe Trumpism and siloed media is here to stay, but I think we just have to keep chipping away and hope that there'll be again some media literacy, or people will begin to understand how to differentiate between fact and fiction. Again, I think Twitter and Facebook starting to do that is a positive step. I mean, I think obviously that then that just lumps them into the list of deep state, anti-Trump, in the minds of the conservatives that say, well, Twitter and Facebook are just on the other side. But I hope that we can see that pendulum begin to swing back. I just don't have all the answers of how we do it. And I think it's going to take a while. I think that we are pretty entrenched in our silos as a nation. And that's true on both sides. I mean, that's not just conservatives. I mean, you see that on the far left as well. And so when we can find, and again, it just goes back to trust, like when we can find a way to trust each other again. And I just don't, I wish I had come here with like a solution and could have given you all hope and faith for the future, but.
Well, identifying problems is certainly the first step, as we know, toward getting a solution. Maybe if I can conclude with just a kind of an optimist. This is a question from Dr. Rosanna Parati, and it was one I had too.
Yeah.
You've spoken a lot in this wonderfully instructive address today and conversation, Colby, about the importance of being our own watchdogs, right? Of being critical readers. Mm-hmm. Were there specific experiences in your time at Hofstra, either classes or your work, or an example from your work? You gave us some lovely illustrations from working at the Chronicle, but that helped you develop your work, inform your work as a journalist, and to become that kind of a critical thinker?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and I'm not just saying this because they're both on the call, but I think I had a handful of professors at Hofstra that helped me to really understand politics and journalism. Stephen Knowlton, who's no longer there, being one of them, Dr. Parati and Dr. Green being others, that just the way that they approached the subjects made me want to know more and be curious. And so I think that is a real testament to them. I think along the way, I mean, one thing that happened actually, which is not really Hofstra related, but I did that semester in DC, which for anyone that can do it, can spend a semester of their time at college. I know it's harder now with COVID, so hopefully that will be over and at some point in the future, and you'll be able to take advantage of spending a semester in DC. It was the most validating experience of my entire life to date, because it told me that this is exactly where I want to be someday. But I interned with a group of students from England in a shared intern housing. They were all interning on the Hill, and their knowledge of the world was so much greater than mine. They knew about world leaders. They could speak other languages. And I just remember feeling like I had a lot of catching up to do in order to. And some of that critical thinking comes with age. But I think that just being curious about the world and surrounding yourself with people that are curious about the world, like Dr. Prati, like Dr. Green, like these other students that I interned with, can be really inspiring.
Okay. Well, Colby, I mean, what a wonderful way to conclude. I mean, just talking from the classroom to the newsroom, right, to the working world. I mean, you are truly inspirational for your teachers, for our students. I just wish we could go to lunch with you now. And we will,
Me too.
as soon as we can. For right now, please just allow me on behalf of Hofstra, the Public Policy Program, Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Kalikow School, a warmest, deepest thanks for your time and your insights today. Really thoughtful and motivational for our students. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. So thank you.
This was a delight. I'll allow Dr. Prati just put in a note there, and I know I'm getting several notation messages here. I'll share these with you, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation as soon as we may do so. So
wonderful. Would love that.
Yeah,
would love that.
We'll have a recording of this available soon, and you'll receive a message about that from your instructors. For now, let me again thank you, Colby. We'll continue to follow you in the news and look forward to talking more.
Yes, thank you so much, and stay safe, everyone, and enjoy the holidays.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.